The gunshots' echo faded into the vast Montana wilderness as Vivian McKenna buried her 7-year-old son beneath the old oak tree behind what remained of their homestead. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new life in the West had transformed into the cruelest of nightmares. The raiders who had descended upon their small farm during her husband's absence had left nothing standing, not the cabin they'd built with their own hands, not the dreams they'd cultivated alongside their crops, and not the beating heart of her only child. A cold wind swept across the freshly turned earth as Vivian placed the small wooden cross she'd fashioned from the ruins of her son's bed. Her fingers, raw and bleeding from digging the grave, trembled as she traced the crude letters she'd carved. Samuel James McKenna, 1869-1876, beloved son. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up days ago, leaving nothing but a hollow emptiness where her heart had once been. 3 days she'd spent digging, refusing help from the neighboring homesteaders who'd come too late to save her boy but had arrived in time to drive off the raiders. Mrs. McKenna, a gentle voice called from behind her. The wagon's ready. We should get to town before nightfall. Vivian didn't turn to acknowledge the speaker. Her eyes remained fixed on the small mound of earth. I'm not leaving him. You can't stay here, madam. There's nothing left. Then there's nothing left for me anywhere, she whispered, the words carried away by the wind that rustled through the charred remains of what had once been her home. Eventually, they convinced her to go. What choice did she have? Winter was approaching, and even grief couldn't warm her against the bitter cold of the Montana Territory. The neighboring family kind people, whose names she barely registered, loaded her onto their wagon with the few possessions that had survived the raid. A scorched family Bible, a tarnished silver locket containing a lock of Samuel's hair, and the clothes on her back. As the wagon pulled away, Vivian felt the final thread connecting her to her faith snap. God, if he existed at all, had abandoned her in this savage land. Prayer hadn't saved her son. Hope hadn't protected their home. Love hadn't been enough to keep her family safe. From this moment forward, she would believe in nothing but the cruel certainty of loss. The journey to the town of Silver Creek passed in a fog. Vivian was vaguely aware of the sympathetic glances cast her way, the hushed conversations about the poor McKenna woman, and questions about her husband's whereabouts. James McKenna had left 2 months earlier to sell their harvest in the larger settlement of Helena. He should have returned weeks ago. In her heart, Vivian knew he was gone to another victim of the lawless frontier that had promised so much and delivered only heartbreak. Silver Creek was barely a town, just a collection of rough-hewn buildings clinging to existence along the stagecoach route. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of homes made up the entirety of civilization. The neighboring family, the Wilsons, she finally remembered arranged for her to stay at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Holloway. Just until you get back on your feet, dear Mrs. Wilson had said with forced cheerfulness as she helped Vivian into the sparse room. Everyone loses someone out here. It's hard country, but we survive. Vivian had nodded, not bothering to explain that she had no interest in surviving. Existing, perhaps, but living required something she no longer possessed faith in tomorrow. Days turned to weeks. Vivian took work at the general store, mechanically stacking supplies and taking inventory. The townsfolk treated her with a mixture of pity and discomfort. No one knew quite what to say to the woman who had lost everything, so most said nothing at all. This suited Vivian fine. Words were empty comfort. Winter descended upon Silver Creek with unforgiving ferocity. Snow piled high against buildings, and temperatures dropped so low that the creek for which the town was named froze solid. Vivian barely noticed. The cold outside could not compare to the frozen wasteland within her. It was during the season's worst blizzard that he arrived in town. The saloon was the only establishment still open that night, and Vivian, having finished her shift at the store, was trudging through knee-deep snow back to the boarding house when the stagecoach pulled in a rare sight given the treacherous conditions. She paused, not out of curiosity, but because the swirling snow momentarily blinded her. That's when she saw him step down from the coach, tall and broad-shouldered, with a worn leather duster covered in snow and ice. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to harsh conditions, pausing only to retrieve a saddle and pack from the storage compartment before tipping his hat to the driver. Under normal circumstances, Vivian would have continued on her way without a second glance. New arrivals were common enough in Silver Creek drifters, prospectors, and cowboys passing through on their way to somewhere else. But something about this stranger made her hesitate. Perhaps it was the way he stood perfectly still for a moment, surveying the town as if taking its measure, or how he seemed unbothered by the howling wind that threatened to topple men of lesser stature. Their eyes met briefly across the snowy street. Even in the dim light from the saloon's windows, Vivian could see the intensity in his gaze, a flash of something that might have been recognition, though she was certain they'd never met. He nodded once in her direction, a small gesture of acknowledgement, before turning toward the saloon's entrance. Vivian continued toward the boarding house, dismissing the encounter from her mind. One more stranger in a strange land meant nothing to her. She had learned the hard way that connections led only to loss, and she had nothing left to lose. The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the snow-covered landscape glittering under a pale winter sun. Vivian rose early, as was her habit since Samuel's death. Sleep brought nightmares, so she avoided it when possible. She dressed quickly in her plain work dress, pinning her dark hair into a severe bun that matched her expression, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Holloway was already bustling around the small dining room, setting out coffee and biscuits for her few boarders. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna," she called cheerfully. "We've got a new guest. Came in on last night's stage. Lucky to make it through that storm, I'd say." Vivian murmured a noncommittal response and poured herself a cup of coffee. She had no interest in Mrs. Holloway's gossip or the boarding house's newest occupant. She just wanted to finish her breakfast and get to the store where she could lose herself in the mindless routine of work. But fate, having already dealt her the cruelest of hands, seemed determined to force another card. The stranger from the previous night entered the dining room, ducking slightly to avoid the low doorframe. In the clear light of morning, Vivian could see him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 to her 26 years, with a face weathered by sun and wind rather than age. His hair was dark, with a slight wave to it, and his eyes were the deep blue of a summer sky, a stark contrast to the otherwise rugged features. "Mrs. Holloway," he greeted the landlady with a nod. "Something smells mighty fine." "Just my usual biscuits, Mr. Preston," the widow replied with a blush that suggested she found the newcomer's presence agreeable. "Help yourself, coffee's hot." The man, Preston, smiled and took a seat at the table, directly across from Vivian. She kept her eyes fixed on her plate, hoping to discourage conversation, but the stranger seemed unconcerned by her obvious desire for solitude. "Paul Preston," he introduced himself, extending a hand across the table. "Just arrived from Wyoming territory." Vivian glanced at his outstretched hand but made no move to take it. "Vivian McKenna," she replied flatly, "and I'm late for work." She stood abruptly, abandoning her half-eaten breakfast, and headed for the door. As she reached for her coat, Preston's voice followed her. "Mrs. McKenna," he called, causing her to pause despite herself. "I believe I knew your husband, James McKenna." Tall fellow with a scar along his jaw from a mining accident, Vivian turned slowly, her heart pounding traitorously in her chest. "You knew James?" Preston nodded, his expression solemn. "Rode with him from Helena to Cheyenne last fall. Good man." He spoke highly of his wife and son back in Silver Creek. The mention of Samuel sent a fresh wave of pain through Vivian's chest, so acute that for a moment she couldn't breathe. "My husband never returned from Helena," she managed finally, "and our son is dead." The stark words hung in the suddenly silent room. Mrs. Holloway busied herself unnecessarily with the coffee pot, pretending not to listen. Preston's expression shifted from surprise to genuine sympathy, but there was something else there too, a hint of purpose that Vivian couldn't decipher. "I'm truly sorry for your losses, Mrs. McKenna," he said quietly. "Perhaps we could talk later. I might have information about your husband that would be of interest to you." Vivian hesitated. Since Samuel's death, she had convinced herself that James must be dead too. It was easier that way to believe that both were gone rather than to nurture the painful hope that her husband might return to a home that no longer existed and a son who lay cold in the ground. "I'm at the general store until 5, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, without waiting for his response, she stepped out into the bitter cold of the winter morning. The day passed with excruciating slowness. For the first time in months, Vivian found herself unable to lose herself in the monotony of her work. Her mind kept returning to the stranger Preston and his claim to have ridden with James. What information could he possibly have, and why had he come to Silver Creek? The town was hardly a destination. It was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. Mr. Abernathy, the store's proprietor, commented more than once on her distraction. "You all right, Mrs. McKenna? You've counted those nails 3 times now." "I'm fine," she replied automatically, "just didn't sleep well." By mid-afternoon, the snow had begun to fall again, fat white flakes that promised another difficult night. The store emptied early as townsfolk hurried home before the weather worsened. At 4:30, Mr. Abernathy patted Vivian on the shoulder. "Why don't you head on out, Mrs. McKenna? Not likely to get any more customers today, and I'd feel better knowing you got back to the boarding house before this turns nasty." Vivian nodded her thanks and gathered her things. As she stepped onto the store's porch, pulling her woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders, she spotted Preston leaning against a hitching post across the street. He straightened when he saw her, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. For a moment, Vivian considered turning back into the store. Whatever information this man had about James, did it really matter now? Nothing would bring back her son or rebuild their home. Nothing would restore her faith in a world that had proven itself so mercilessly cruel. But something, perhaps the last flickering ember of the woman she had once been, propelled her forward, across the street to where Preston waited. "You're early," she said by way of greeting. "Thought I might catch you before the weather turns," he replied, gesturing toward the darkening sky. "There's coffee at the saloon. Not as good as Mrs. Holloway's, but it's warm." Vivian hesitated. The saloon was not a place respectable women frequented in Silver Creek, though she had long since stopped caring about such distinctions. Still, the prospect of town gossip was unappealing. Reading her thoughts, Preston added, "Or we could walk a spell. I've found moving keeps a body warmer than sitting." "Walking is fine," Vivian decided, wrapping her shawl more securely around her shoulders. They set off down the main street, the snow crunching beneath their boots. For several minutes, neither spoke. Vivian was acutely aware of Preston's presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the slight jingle of spurs on his boots, the scent of leather and horses that seemed to cling to him. "You said you had information about my husband," she prompted finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer. Preston nodded, his expression grave. "I do, though I'm not sure it's what you want to hear." "Is he dead?" Vivian asked bluntly. "Just tell me plain." "No, madam." "At least he wasn't when I last saw him in Cheyenne, about 2 months back." Vivian stopped walking, her legs suddenly unsteady. "He's alive, you're certain?" "As certain as a man can be about such things. We parted ways in Cheyenne. He was planning to head east, said he had business in St. Louis." "St. Louis," Vivian echoed in disbelief. "What business would James have in St. Louis?" Preston's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Mrs. McKenna, Vivian, your husband spoke of many things during our journey. He mentioned his farm, his son, and his wife. But some of what he shared suggests he may not have been entirely forthcoming with you about his past or his intentions. Cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in Vivian's chest. "What are you saying, Mr. Preston?" "I believe your husband may have had another life before Montana, perhaps even another family. In St. Louis." The words hit Vivian like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, and Preston reached out to steady her, his hand warm and solid on her arm. For a moment, she leaned into that support, too shocked to maintain her usual reserve. "That's not possible," she whispered. "James and I were married for 8 years. We came west from Pennsylvania together. He wouldn't." But even as she protested, memories surfaced inconsistencies in James's stories about his past, his reluctance to discuss his family, the mysterious business trips that often took longer than expected. Had she been too trusting, too willing to believe in the man she'd loved? "I'm sorry," Preston said softly. "I debated whether to tell you at all, especially after learning about your son, but I figured you deserved the truth, however painful." Vivian pulled away from his steadying hand, wrapping her arms around herself. "Why are you here, Mr. Preston?" "You could have kept writing. My husband's deceptions weren't your burden to bear." Preston's blue eyes held hers for a long moment before he answered. "I'm a Texas Ranger, Mrs. McKenna, or I was. Now I work for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Your husband is wanted for fraud in 3 states. He's been traveling the frontier, establishing homesteads, building respectable lives, then disappearing with investors' money." The world seemed to tilt beneath Vivian's feet. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be right. We struggled for every penny. Our farm barely supported us." "The money never stayed with him long," Preston explained gently. "Gambling debts, mostly. By the time he met you, he was probably trying to start fresh but old habits." "Stop," Vivian cut him off, unable to bear any more revelations. "Just stop. I don't want to hear this." Snow was falling more heavily now, collecting on their shoulders and hair. The street had emptied as townsfolk sought shelter from the coming storm. Preston glanced at the darkening sky with concern. "We should get back," he said. "This storm's setting in for the night." Vivian nodded mechanically, too numb to argue. They walked in silence back toward the boarding house, the wind picking up around them, driving the snow in stinging sheets. By the time they reached Mrs. Holloway's front porch, Vivian was shivering uncontrollably, as much from emotional shock as from the cold. Preston held the door for her, his expression troubled. "Mrs. McKenna, Vivian, I truly am sorry. I didn't come here to cause you more pain." Vivian paused in the doorway, finally meeting his gaze directly. "Then why did you come, Mr. Preston? To arrest my husband, to warn me, or just to destroy what little was left of my world?" Without waiting for his answer, she stepped inside, leaving him standing in the swirling snow. That night, alone in her small room, Vivian wept for the first time since burying Samuel. She wept for her son, for the home they had built, for the husband she thought she had known, and for the woman she had once been trusting, faithful, full of hope for the future. That woman was gone now, as surely as if she'd been buried alongside her child. Outside, the blizzard raged, matching the storm within her heart. By morning, Silver Creek would be buried under feet of snow, roads impassable, the town isolated until the spring thaw. And Vivian would be trapped with the man who had shattered the last of her illusions, the stranger who claimed to know the truth about her life. The storm continued for 3 days, confining the residents of Silver Creek to their homes and businesses. Vivian avoided Preston as much as possible within the confines of the boarding house, taking her meals early or late, and spending long hours in her room despite the cold that seeped through the thin walls. On the 4th day, the sun emerged, revealing a transformed landscape. Snow drifted higher than a man's head in places, and the townspeople emerged with shovels to carve paths between buildings. Vivian volunteered to help Mr. Abernathy clear a path to the general store, grateful for the physical labor that left her too exhausted to think. She was sweeping the store's porch late that afternoon when Preston approached, leading a horse through the newly cleared street. "Mrs. McKenna," he called, stopping at the bottom of the steps. I wondered if I might have a word. Vivian leaned on her broom, regarding him warily. In the days since their conversation, she had cycled through shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, a reluctant acceptance. If James truly was the man Preston described, it explained much about their marriage: the unexplained absences, the occasional windfalls of cash, his resistance to putting down permanent roots until Montana. "What is it, Mr. Preston?" she asked, her voice cooler than the air between them. "I'm riding out tomorrow," he said. "The pass should be clear enough for a single rider, and I've business that won't wait." Vivian nodded, ignoring the unexpected twinge of something at the news of his departure. "I wish you safe travels, then." Preston shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Before I go, I wanted to apologize properly. I handled our conversation poorly. You deserved better than to have such news delivered so bluntly, especially given your recent loss." The mention of Samuel sent a familiar ache through Vivian's chest, but it was duller now, overlaid with the newer pain of James's betrayal. "You were just doing your job, Mr. Preston. I suppose I should thank you for the truth, however unwelcome." "There's more," Preston said, his voice dropping lower. "I didn't tell you everything about my purpose here." Vivian tensed. What more could there possibly be? "I'm not just tracking your husband for fraud. There's evidence he may have been involved with the men who raided your homestead." The world seemed to stop. Vivian gripped the broom handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What did you say?" Preston's eyes were full of regret. "The raid wasn't random, Mrs. McKenna. The men were looking for something money your husband had taken from some very dangerous people. They thought he'd hidden it at your farm." "My son," Vivian whispered, horror washing over her. "They killed my son because of James." "I believe so," Preston confirmed gently. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to tell you until I was certain, but I couldn't leave without you knowing the full truth." Vivian's legs gave way, and she sank onto the porch steps, the broom clattering beside her. The revelation was too enormous, too monstrous to comprehend. Samuel had died not because of the random violence of the frontier, but because of his father's actions. The child had paid the price for James's sins. Preston tied his horse to the hitching post and came to sit beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. For a long while, neither spoke. The winter sun began to sink toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street. "What will you do now?" Vivian finally asked, her voice hollow. "Continue tracking him," Preston replied. "My instructions are to bring him back to face justice in Wyoming territory first, then hand him over to authorities in the other states where he's wanted. And what am I supposed to do?" The question burst from her before she could stop it, raw with pain and confusion. "My son is dead. My home is gone. The husband I thought I knew never existed. What am I supposed to do with what's left of my life?" Preston was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I can't answer that for you, Vivian, but I know what I've seen in the 4 days I've been in this town. I've seen a woman who survived the unimaginable, who gets up every morning and faces the day despite having every reason to surrender. That kind of strength. It's rare." Vivian gave a bitter laugh. "Strength? Is that what you call this empty shell I've become? I don't live, Mr. Preston, I exist. There's a difference." "Maybe so," he acknowledged, "but existing is the first step back to living, and maybe someday—" "No," Vivian cut him off sharply. "Don't offer me empty platitudes about time healing all wounds or God having a plan. I stopped believing in such things the day I buried my son." Preston nodded, accepting her rebuke without argument. "Fair enough. But if you won't believe in God or time, maybe you could try believing in something else." "Like what?" "Like justice," he suggested. "Believing that the men responsible for your son's death will answer for their crimes." Vivian turned to look at him directly, really seeing him for the first time since their initial encounter. There was a steadiness to Paul Preston that reminded her of the mountains themselves, unmovable, reliable, enduring despite the storms that raged around them. And how am I supposed to believe in justice when the law is days away in any direction and the guilty ride free? She asked. Preston held her gaze, his blue eyes intent. Believe in me instead. The simple statement hung in the cold air between them. Not a platitude or an empty promise, but an offer solid and tangible as the man himself. You're leaving tomorrow, Vivian pointed out. Yes, he acknowledged, but I'll return. When I've found your husband and the men who raided your farm, I'll come back and tell you myself that justice has been served. You have my word. Vivian wanted to dismiss his promise as meaningless. What was one more broken vow in a life already shattered by broken promises? And yet, something in Preston's direct gaze made her hesitate. This man was different from James. There was no charm or smoothness to him, just a straightforward honesty that was compelling in its simplicity. Why would you do that? She asked. Come back, I mean. Your job would be done. A slight smile touched Preston's lips. Maybe I have my own reasons for wanting to see Silver Creek again. Before Vivian could respond, Mr. Abernathy called from inside the store, asking for help with a delivery. The moment broke, and Vivian stood, brushing snow from her skirt. I should get back to work, she said. Preston rose as well, reaching for his horse's reins. Of course, I need to finish preparations for tomorrow's ride. Vivian turned toward the store, then paused. Mr. Preston? Yes, be careful. If these men killed once for whatever James took, they won't hesitate to kill again. Preston's expression softened slightly. I'll be careful, Mrs. McKenna, and when I return, perhaps you'll call me Paul. With that, he tipped his hat and led his horse back down the street, leaving Vivian with an unexpected and unwelcome realization despite everything. She found herself hoping he would indeed return to Silver Creek. The following morning dawned clear and cold. Vivian rose early, as was her habit, and was surprised to find herself moving to the window that overlooked the street. From her vantage point, she could see the stables where Preston would be preparing for his journey. She told herself she was merely curious about the weather conditions, not watching for a glimpse of the Pinkerton agent. A movement caught her eye. Preston leading his horse from the stable, saddlebags packed, and rifle secured in its scabbard. He paused to speak with the stable boy, then swung into the saddle with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. As if sensing her gaze, he glanced up toward her window. Vivian stepped back quickly, her heart racing unexpectedly. She had no reason to feel this strange connection to a man she barely knew, a man who had brought her nothing but painful revelations. And yet, as she heard the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance, she couldn't deny the hollow feeling in her chest. Life in Silver Creek resumed its monotonous rhythm. Winter maintained its grip on the landscape, though the worst of the blizzards seemed to have passed. Vivian continued her work at the general store, finding a strange comfort in the routine that had once felt like a prison. The townsfolk, sensing some indefinable change in her, began to treat her with less caution and more genuine warmth. 3 weeks passed with no word from Preston. Vivian told herself she wasn't counting the days, wasn't watching the road each time the stagecoach arrived. She was simply curious about her husband's fate, whether justice would indeed be served as Preston had promised. It was late February when the letter arrived. Mr. Abernathy handed it to her with raised eyebrows, clearly intrigued by correspondence addressed to the widow who rarely received mail. Vivian recognized the handwriting immediately, though she'd only seen it once before on the guest register at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. She waited until her shift ended before opening the letter, retreating to her room where she could read its contents in private. Dear Mrs. McKenna, it began, I hope this letter finds you well. I write from Cheyenne, where I have successfully apprehended your husband. He is currently in the custody of the territorial marshal and will stand trial for his crimes next month. I have evidence that should ensure his conviction, including testimony from several of his victims. Regarding the men responsible for the raid on your homestead, I have made progress, but not yet achieved the justice I promised you. Your husband reluctantly provided names after considerable persuasion. 3 men, led by a former associate of his named Victor Rawlings. They are believed to be operating in the Dakota Territory now, and I leave tomorrow to continue my pursuit. I understand this news may bring little comfort. Justice for your son requires more than your husband's imprisonment for fraud. I have not forgotten my promise to you, and I will not rest until all responsible parties have answered for their crimes. Silver Creek remains in my thoughts, as do you. Your strength in the face of such profound loss continues to impress me. I hope that in my absence you have found some measure of peace, however small. With sincere regard, Paul Preston. Vivian read the letter 3 times, her fingers tracing the firm, clear handwriting. James was captured, the husband who had betrayed her in ways she was still struggling to comprehend. She should feel satisfaction, perhaps even vindication. Instead, she felt strangely empty. James's arrest couldn't bring Samuel back or restore the life she had lost. And yet, Preston's words about her strength stirred something within her, a small spark of something that might, with care, grow into pride. She had survived. Despite everything, she continued to face each day. Perhaps that was a kind of strength after all. The knowledge that Preston was now hunting the men directly responsible for Samuel's death brought a different emotion: concern. These were clearly dangerous men, willing to kill a child in their search for whatever James had taken. Preston was walking into danger on her behalf, to fulfill a promise made to a woman he barely knew. That night, for the first time since Samuel's death, Vivian found herself offering a small, tentative prayer not to the God she had renounced, but to whatever forces might be listening. A simple prayer for the safety of a man with steady blue eyes and an unwavering sense of justice. Spring came early to Montana that year. By mid-March, the snow was retreating, revealing the muddy earth beneath. The creek broke free of ice, rushing with the meltwater from the mountains. Silver Creek stirred from its winter dormancy, with new merchandise arriving on more frequent stagecoaches and travelers passing through on their way to points west. Vivian found herself changing with the season. The crushing weight of grief remained, but it had shifted somehow, becoming a part of her rather than consuming her entirely. She began to notice small beauties again: the first green shoots pushing through the mud, the return of birdsong in the mornings, the longer days and softening light. She also began to take more interest in the town itself. When Mr. Abernathy mentioned difficulty obtaining certain supplies, Vivian suggested writing to merchants in Helena who might offer better prices. When Mrs. Holloway complained of rheumatism that made cleaning the upper rooms difficult, Vivian volunteered to help. Small steps, tentative re-engagements with the world around her. April arrived with no further word from Preston. Vivian told herself she wasn't worried. A man tracking dangerous criminals across the frontier could hardly be expected to maintain regular correspondence. Still, she found herself scanning the faces of riders entering town, watching the stagecoach arrivals with more attention than strictly necessary. It was on a particularly fine spring day that Vivian made a decision. The anniversary of Samuel's death was approaching, and she felt a growing need to visit his grave. The homestead was a day's ride from Silver Creek, too far to travel alone in winter, but manageable now that the roads had dried. Mr. Abernathy, concerned about her traveling alone, insisted on arranging an escort. Ned Wilson's heading that direction tomorrow to check on his brother's place. He'd be glad for the company, I'm sure. Vivian agreed reluctantly. The Wilsons had been kind to her after the raid, but their pity was sometimes harder to bear than outright avoidance. Still, the prospect of seeing Samuel's resting place overrode her discomfort. They set out at dawn the next morning, Vivian riding a gentle mare borrowed from the livery stable. The journey was largely silent, with Ned making occasional comments about the weather or pointing out landmarks. Vivian was grateful for his restraint. Many would have filled the hours with awkward attempts at conversation. As they crested the final rise overlooking what had been the McKenna homestead, Vivian felt her breath catch. Spring had transformed the landscape. Where she remembered charred ruins and a fresh grave, nature had begun its work of reclamation. Green grass covered the burned-out foundation of the cabin, and wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze. "Would you like me to wait here?" Ned asked quietly. "Give you some privacy?" Vivian nodded, not trusting her voice. She dismounted and handed him the reins, then walked slowly down the slope toward the old oak tree where she had buried her son. The crude wooden cross she had fashioned still stood, though it leaned slightly to one side. The mound of earth had settled, and spring flowers, tiny blue ones whose name she didn't know had sprouted across it. Vivian knelt beside the grave, brushing her fingers over the rough wood of the cross. "Hello, Samuel," she whispered. "I've come back, just like I promised." For a long while, she simply sat beside the grave, watching the play of sunlight through the oak's new leaves. She told Samuel about Silver Creek, about her work at the general store, about the people who had shown her kindness. She told him about Preston and his pursuit of James and the raiders. "Your father did terrible things," she said softly. "Things I never imagined him capable of, but you should know that he loved you, Samuel, whatever else he was, whatever lies he told. His love for you was real. I have to believe that." The admission cost her, but it felt necessary, a truth she needed to acknowledge for her son's sake, if not for her own. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Vivian finally rose. She had brought nothing to mark her visit, no flowers or tokens, but she found herself unwilling to leave without some gesture. Impulsively, she removed the silver locket she wore around her neck, the one containing a lock of Samuel's hair, and hung it carefully on the cross. "I'll always carry you in my heart," she told her son. "I don't need this to remember." The ride back to Silver Creek was easier somehow. A weight hadn't lifted. Vivian knew she would carry the grief of Samuel's loss for the rest of her life, but something had shifted, allowing her to breathe more freely than she had in months. They arrived in town just as dusk was falling. Ned Wilson left her at the boarding house with a respectful nod and a mumbled, "Anytime you need to go back, Mrs. McKenna, just let me know." Vivian thanked him and climbed the steps to the porch, suddenly aware of how physically exhausted she was. She had just reached for the door when a voice spoke from the shadows at the far end of the porch. "You cut your hair." Vivian whirled, her hand flying to her throat where the missing locket should have been. Paul Preston stepped into the pool of light cast by the lantern beside the door. He looked trail-worn and weary, with several days' growth of beard shadowing his jaw and a new scar across his left cheekbone, but his blue eyes were as steady as she remembered. "Mr. Preston," she managed, her heart racing unexpectedly. "You're back." "I said I would be," he replied simply. Vivian's hand unconsciously moved to her hair, which she had indeed cut shorter during his absence, the dark locks now just brushing her shoulders rather than falling down her back. "How long have you been here?" "Rode in about an hour ago. Mrs. Holloway said you'd gone to visit your son's grave." The casual mention of Samuel didn't bring the usual stab of pain, perhaps because Preston said it so matter-of-factly without the awkward hesitation most people displayed. "Yes," she confirmed. "It seemed time." Preston nodded, understanding in his gaze. "And was it helpful?" Vivian considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said finally. "It was." A small smile touched Preston's lips. "I'm glad." They stood in silence for a moment, the spring evening settling around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "Did you find them?" Vivian asked finally. "The men who killed my son," Preston's expression hardened. "Two of them, Victor Rawlings and his brother Joseph. They resisted arrest near Deadwood. Neither survived." The blunt statement should have shocked her, but Vivian felt only a grim satisfaction. "And the third man?" "Still looking," Preston admitted, "but I have a name and a good description. It's just a matter of time." Vivian nodded, accepting his determination as the certainty it was. "You kept your word, about bringing James to justice and about coming back." "I'm a man who believes in keeping promises, Mrs. McKenna," Preston said quietly. Vivian, she corrected him. I think after everything you should call me Vivian. His smile widened slightly. Vivian then, and I'm Paul, as I believe I mentioned before leaving. The use of first names created an unexpected intimacy between them, standing in the gathering darkness on the boarding house porch. Vivian became acutely aware of his physical presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the weathered hands that rested easily at his sides, the faint scent of leather and horses that seemed to define him. How long will you stay in Silver Creek? She asked, breaking the moment before it became overwhelming. A while, Paul replied. I've taken a leave of absence from the agency. Thought I might see what opportunities the Montana Territory has to offer. The implication hung in the air between them that he was staying, at least in part, because of her. Vivian wasn't ready for such a possibility, wasn't sure she would ever be ready to trust her heart to another man after James's betrayal, and yet she couldn't deny the small flutter of something. At the thought of Paul Preston remaining in Silver Creek. Well, she said finally, Mrs. Holloway serves breakfast at 7. Perhaps you join me tomorrow and you can tell me more about your travels. Paul's expression warmed. I'd like that very much, Vivian. She nodded once, then turned toward the door. Good night, then. Good night, he replied softly. And Vivian, she paused, her hand on the doorknob. Yes, the shorter hair suits you. With that simple compliment, the first she'd received in longer than she could remember, Paul tipped his hat and descended the porch steps, heading toward the livery stable where he presumably had a room arranged. Vivian stood for a long moment after he'd gone, her fingers touching the ends of her shortened hair. For the first time in months, she felt a faint stirring of something that might, with care, grow into hope. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm unlike anything Vivian had experienced since Samuel's death. She continued her work at the general store, but the days no longer blurred together in a haze of grief. Instead, she found herself noticing details, the changing patterns of spring light, the increasing bustle in town as the weather improved, the way Paul Preston had integrated himself into the life of Silver Creek with remarkable ease. He had taken a room at the livery stable, helping the aging owner with repairs and horse training in exchange for lodging. Word of his former profession spread quickly in the small town, and soon the mayor was approaching him about serving as a temporary sheriff until the territorial governor could appoint an official one. Not interested in wearing a badge again, Paul told Vivian over their now regular breakfast meetings. Did my time enforcing the law, looking for something different now. What then? Vivian asked, genuinely curious about his plans. Silver Creek doesn't offer many opportunities for former lawmen. Paul's gaze was thoughtful as he considered her question. Been thinking about ranching. There's good land north of town that nobody's claimed yet. Wouldn't take much to start small, some cattle, a decent horse or two. Ranching requires roots, Vivian observed. I thought you were a man who preferred to keep moving. A man can change, Paul replied simply. Find reasons to stay in one place. The implication hung between them, neither acknowledging it directly. This had become their pattern moments of near honesty about whatever was growing between them, followed by careful retreats to safer ground. Vivian wasn't ready for more, and Paul seemed content to give her the time she needed. May arrived with unseasonable warmth, bringing the town fully to life after the long winter. Gardens were planted, houses repaired, and plans made for the summer months ahead. Vivian found herself drawn into these activities, her isolation gradually giving way to cautious re-engagement with the community. It was Mrs. Holloway who suggested she might want to plant flowers in the small patch of earth behind the boarding house. Always thought it would be nice to have a garden back there, the widow remarked. Good spot for sitting in the evenings if it was fixed up proper. To Vivian's surprise, she found herself agreeing. The next day, she purchased seeds from Mr. Abernathy's store and began clearing the overgrown patch. The physical labor was satisfying in a way her work at the store wasn't connecting her to the earth, to growing things, to the possibility of beauty emerging from neglect. Paul found her there on the third afternoon, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and perspiration dampening her collar. He stood watching for a moment before she noticed him, a curious expression on his face. "Mrs. Holloway said I'd find you back here," he explained when she looked up. "Said you were creating a miracle." Vivian brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, leaving a smudge of dirt behind. "Hardly a miracle, just some basic clearing and planting." Paul moved closer, surveying her work with genuine interest. "Looks like more than that to me. What are you growing?" "Marigolds along the border," Vivian pointed. "Morning glories to climb that trellis once I've repaired it. Sweet peas, pansies, and some herbs Mrs. Holloway can use for cooking." "No vegetables?" Vivian shook her head. "Mr. Abernathy has a large vegetable garden. He shares with Mrs. Holloway already. This is just for beauty, I suppose." Paul nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Beauty matters, especially in places where life is hard." The simple observation touched something in Vivian, a recognition that he understood what she was doing, perhaps better than she did herself. She wasn't just planting flowers, she was asserting that beauty still had a place in her world, despite everything she had lost. "I could help with that trellis," Paul offered. "Got some experience with carpentry." "I'd appreciate that," Vivian said, surprised to find she meant it. The prospect of working alongside him wasn't unwelcome, as it might have been even a month earlier. Over the next several days, they fell into an unexpected partnership. Paul would come by after his work at the livery, bringing tools and materials for the garden projects. Vivian would join him after her shift at the store. They worked mostly in companionable silence, with occasional conversations about practical matters: the best angle for the trellis, whether the bench needed a back, how to keep rabbits from the tender shoots. Gradually, their conversations expanded beyond the garden. Paul spoke of his childhood in Texas, his years as a ranger, and his decision to join the Pinkerton agency. Vivian, more hesitantly, shared stories of her life before Montana, her childhood in Pennsylvania, her meeting with James, their early years together. "He wasn't always what he became," she said one evening as they sat on the newly constructed bench, surveying their day's work. "When we first married, he was kind, hardworking. I think he truly wanted to be the man I believed him to be." Paul considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Some men are built for deception, finding it easier than honesty. Others start with good intentions, but get pulled off course by temptation or circumstance." "Which was James, do you think?" Vivian asked, curious about his assessment of her husband. "Not my place to say," Paul replied carefully. "But I believe most men know the difference between right and wrong, whatever story they tell themselves to justify their choices." It was a fair answer, neither condemning James entirely nor excusing his actions. Vivian appreciated Paul's refusal to offer easy judgments, even when they might have been welcome. "The trial is next week," she said after a moment. "In Cheyenne," Paul nodded. "You thinking of going?" Vivian had been wrestling with this question since receiving the official summons to testify. Part of her wanted to face James, to look him in the eye and ask why the lies, why the betrayal, why he had put their son at risk. Another part wanted to leave the past buried, to focus on rebuilding her life in Silver Creek. "I don't know," she admitted. "Would my testimony make a difference?" "Legally, probably not. They have enough evidence without it." Paul turned to look at her directly. "But it might make a difference to you." Vivian considered this. "Would you? Would you go with me if I decided to go?" The question surprised them both. It implied a level of trust and dependency that Vivian hadn't intended to acknowledge. But once spoken, she couldn't take it back, nor, she realized, did she want to. Paul's expression softened. "If that's what you want, Vivian, yes, I'd go with you." The decision made, arrangements followed quickly. Mr. Abernathy granted Vivian a week's leave from the store, Mrs. Holloway packed food for their journey, and Paul secured places on the eastbound stagecoach to Cheyenne. They departed Silver Creek on a clear June morning, the town already stirring with activity as farmers brought goods to market and merchants prepared for the day's business. Vivian felt a strange mixture of trepidation and anticipation as the stagecoach pulled away. She was leaving the safe routine she had established, venturing into uncertainty with only Paul Preston's steady presence as an anchor. The journey to Cheyenne took 3 days, with overnight stops at stagecoach stations along the route. Despite the discomfort of travel dust, heat, and the constant jolting of the coach, Vivian found herself oddly at peace. There was something liberating about being in motion, between places, committed to a purpose beyond mere survival. Paul proved an ideal traveling companion, attentive, without being overbearing, respectful of her need for silence at times, and adept at handling the practical aspects of frontier travel. By the time they reached Cheyenne, a comfortable ease had developed between them, built on shared experience rather than mere proximity. Cheyenne itself was larger and more developed than Silver Creek, with proper streets, substantial buildings, and the bustle of a growing territorial capital. Paul secured rooms for them at a respectable hotel near the courthouse, separate rooms, with a connecting door that remained firmly closed, maintaining propriety despite their increasingly intimate friendship. The trial began the following day. Vivian, dressed in her best gown, a dark blue wool that had rarely been worn since her arrival in Montana, took her seat in the courtroom with Paul beside her. When James was led in, shackled and wearing prison clothes, she felt a curious detachment, as if observing a stranger rather than the man who had been her husband. James looked older, thinner, the charm that had once defined him replaced by a wary resignation. He noticed Vivian immediately, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing as he registered Paul's presence beside her. A complex series of emotions crossed his face: shame, defiance, and finally, a resigned acknowledgement of what they had both lost. The proceedings were straightforward. Multiple witnesses testified to James's fraudulent activities across several territories. Documents were presented showing the pattern of deception spanning nearly a decade, including, to Vivian's shock, evidence of a previous marriage in Missouri that had never been legally dissolved. When it was her turn to testify, Vivian approached the stand with a calm she hadn't expected to feel. She spoke clearly about their years together, the homestead in Montana, and the raid that had taken her son's life. She did not embellish or condemn. She simply told the truth as she had experienced it. James watched her throughout, his expression unreadable. When the prosecutor asked about her knowledge of her husband's activities, Vivian answered honestly. "I knew nothing of his fraudulent dealings or his past. I believed him to be an honest man, a good father, and a faithful husband. I was wrong on all counts." The statement, delivered without obvious rancor, seemed to affect James more deeply than any accusation might have. He flinched visibly, his gaze dropping to his shackled hands. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge sentenced James to 15 years in the territorial prison, a sentence that, given the harsh conditions, many did not survive. As James was led away, he paused, looking directly at Vivian. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "For Samuel, for everything." Vivian nodded once, acknowledging his apology without accepting it. Some betrayals were too profound for forgiveness, some losses too great to be reconciled with mere words. As James disappeared through the side door, she felt a chapter of her life closing definitively. Paul stood waiting for her at the back of the courtroom, his expression concerned. "You all right?" "Yes," Vivian replied, surprised to find it was true. "It's over now." They walked back to the hotel in silence, the June sun warm on their shoulders. Vivian felt lighter somehow, as if the trial had released her from bonds she hadn't fully recognized. James would pay for his crimes, and while that couldn't bring Samuel back or restore what had been lost, there was a certain justice in it. That evening, they dined in the hotel restaurant. both dressed in their best clothes, a final formality before the journey back to Montana. Over dessert, Paul brought up a subject they had carefully avoided until now. "What will you do now, Vivian? Will you stay in Silver Creek?" The question hung between them, laden with implications neither had directly addressed. Vivian considered her answer carefully. "I think so, yes. I've made a life there of sorts. It's not what I imagined for myself, but it's mine." She paused, then added more softly, "And there are things people in Silver Creek that matter to me now." Paul's expression remained carefully neutral, though his eyes warmed at her words. "I'm glad to hear it. I've been thinking myself that Silver Creek might be a good place to put down roots." "Have you?" Vivian asked, her heart beating a little faster despite her efforts at composure. "I have," Paul confirmed. "In fact, I've taken steps in that direction, purchased that land north of town I mentioned. 100 acres, with good water access and decent grazing." Vivian's surprise must have shown on her face, for Paul continued quickly. "It's just raw land for now. Building a ranch takes time, but I've always believed in starting with a solid foundation." The metaphor wasn't lost on Vivian. Paul Preston was not a man who rushed into things, not building a ranch and not building a relationship. He had given her space and time to heal, to find her own way back to living rather than merely existing. And now, he was telling her, in his straightforward way, that he had made plans for a future in Silver Creek, a future that could include her if she chose. "A solid foundation is important," she agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Though I've learned that even the strongest structures can be tested by storms." Paul's gaze held hers across the table. "True enough. But some foundations endure, no matter what comes. It's about the materials you build with and the care you take in the building." They were no longer talking about ranches or buildings, and they both knew it. Vivian felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the June evening or the wine they had shared with dinner. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to see this land of yours when we return to Silver Creek." Paul's smile was slow and genuine. "I'd like that very much, Vivian." They returned to Montana 3 days later. The journey back to Silver Creek, passing more quickly than Vivian would have thought possible. The town welcomed them with the casual acceptance of a community that had seen them leave together and return together, drawing its own conclusions without requiring explanations. Life resumed its rhythm, but with subtle differences. Paul joined Vivian in the garden behind the boarding house more frequently. Their conversations deepened, touching on hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments. They began taking Sunday walks together after church services, Vivian having cautiously returned to attending, not out of renewed faith, but out of a desire to reconnect with the community. It was during one such walk, on a particularly fine July afternoon, that Paul formally invited Vivian to visit his land. They rode north from town the following Saturday, a picnic basket secured behind Vivian's saddle and a map in Paul's saddlebag. The property was everything Paul had described: rolling grassland stretching toward distant mountains, with a clear creek running through its heart and stands of pine offering natural shelter. Paul had marked the boundaries with stakes and had begun clearing an area for a cabin near the creek. "It's beautiful," Vivian said honestly as they sat on a fallen log, sharing the lunch Mrs. Holloway had packed. "I can see why you chose it." Paul nodded, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed the land. "It has good bones, as my father would have said. Needs a lot of work, but the potential is there." "And you're certain this is what you want?" Vivian asked. "Ranching instead of law work, staying in one place instead of traveling?" Paul turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes steady. "I'm certain, Vivian. I've spent most of my life chasing other men's wrongs, bringing others to justice. I'm ready to build something of my own." The simplicity of his statement touched Vivian deeply. She understood the desire to create rather than merely respond, to build a future not defined by the past's shadows. "I hope you find what you're looking for here," she said softly. Paul's gaze held hers for a long moment. I believe I already have. The implication was clear, but Paul didn't press further. Instead, he showed her the rest of the property where he planned to build corrals, where the best grazing land lay, where he thought fruit trees might grow if properly tended. Vivian listened and offered suggestions, finding herself unexpectedly engaged in envisioning what the raw land could become. As they prepared to ride back to town late that afternoon, Paul helped Vivian mount her horse, his hands strong and steady at her waist. When she was settled in the saddle, he didn't immediately release her, looking up with an expression that made her heart beat faster. "Vivian," he said, his voice low and serious, "I know you've had more than your share of loss and betrayal. I know trust doesn't come easy anymore, but I want you to know that my intentions are honorable and my feelings for you are real." Vivian's breath caught at the directness of his declaration. Paul Preston wasn't a man for flowery speeches or grand gestures, but his straightforward honesty held more power than any poetic declaration could have. I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's still so much." "I understand," Paul assured her, finally stepping back. "I'm not asking for promises, Vivian, just for you to know where I stand. The rest can come in its own time if it's meant to." They rode back to Silver Creek in companionable silence, the summer evening settling around them with golden light and the gentle sounds of the Montana wilderness. Vivian found herself thinking not of the past of James's betrayal or Samuel's loss, but of possibilities she had thought forever closed to her. Could she trust again? Could she open her heart to this steady, honorable man who had already proven himself in ways James never had? The questions had no immediate answers, but for the first time in more than a year, Vivian found herself willing to consider them. August brought a heat wave that baked the Montana landscape, turning the hills golden and the creek beds dry. Silver Creek slowed its pace, with townsfolk conducting necessary business in the cool morning hours and retreating to shade during the worst of the afternoon heat. Paul continued work on his ranch, rising before dawn to make progress before the day grew too hot. He hired 2 local men to help with the cabin construction, and by mid-month, the basic structure was taking shape, a solid log building with a stone foundation and a porch that would catch the morning sun. Vivian followed the progress with growing interest. Paul often stopped by the general store on his way back to town, dusty and tired but eager to share the day's accomplishments. Mr. Abernathy, noting these visits with knowing eyes, began finding reasons to be elsewhere in the store when Paul arrived, giving them a measure of privacy that both appreciated and found mildly embarrassing. It was during one such visit, on a particularly sweltering afternoon, that Paul invited Vivian to a social gathering at his partially completed ranch. "Thought I'd have a little celebration when the roof's on," he explained, leaning against the counter while Vivian restocked shelves. "Nothing fancy, just some food, maybe some music if anyone brings an instrument. A way to thank the folks who have helped and to introduce the place properly to the community." Vivian paused in her work, a can of peaches in her hand. "That sounds nice." "Wouldn't be right without you there," Paul added, his expression earnest. "Being as you've had a hand in planning much of it, it was true in a way." Over the weeks, since their first visit to the property, Vivian had offered numerous suggestions that Paul had incorporated into his plans, from the placement of windows to catch the best light to the design of the kitchen, where, as he put it, a woman would feel comfortable working. "I'd be happy to come," she replied, feeling a flutter of anticipation that had become increasingly familiar in Paul's presence. "Should I bring something? Food, perhaps?" Paul's smile warmed his entire face. "Just yourself, Vivian, that's all I need." The gathering took place the following Saturday, with nearly half the town making the journey to Paul's ranch. Wagons and riders arrived throughout the afternoon, bearing food, drink, and the easy camaraderie of a frontier community celebrating one of its own. The cabin, though still lacking interior finishes, stood proudly on a small rise overlooking the creek. Paul had built a long table under the shade of a large pine, where the contributions of food were arranged for all to share. Someone brought a fiddle, another a harmonica, and as the afternoon progressed into evening, music and laughter filled the air. Vivian found herself enjoying the celebration more than she had anticipated. The townspeople treated her with a natural friendliness that had been absent in the months after Samuel's death, when their pity had created a barrier she couldn't breach. Now, she was simply Vivian, a woman helping to serve food, chatting with neighbors, occasionally casting glances toward the tall figure of their host as he moved among his guests. Paul was in his element, Vivian realized. For all his quiet nature, he had a gift for making people feel welcome, for finding common ground with farmers and merchants alike. She watched as he showed a group of children the small corral he had built, lifting the youngest to pet the gentle mare he had acquired for ranch work. As twilight descended, lanterns were lit, creating pools of golden light in the gathering darkness. Families with young children began to depart, but a good number remained, the celebration showing no signs of ending. The music shifted to slower, more contemplative tunes, and couples began to dance on the packed earth in front of the cabin. Paul appeared at Vivian's side as she stood watching the dancers, a cup of coffee in her hands. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked quietly. "Very much," she replied honestly. "You've created something special here, Paul." He gazed around at the gathering at the cabin silhouetted against the darkening sky, the lantern light reflecting in the nearby creek, the people enjoying themselves on land that had been empty wilderness just months before. "It's a beginning," he acknowledged, "but a good one, I think." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the fiddle player's rendition of a bittersweet frontier ballad. Then Paul turned to her, extending his hand. "Would you dance with me, Vivian?" The simple request held deeper implications than mere movement to music. Dancing meant physical closeness, public acknowledgement of whatever was growing between them. Vivian hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I'd like that," she said softly. Paul led her to the edge of the makeshift dance floor, one hand coming to rest respectfully at her waist while the other held hers. They began to move in time with the music, somewhat stiffly at first, both out of practice, both acutely aware of the watching eyes of their neighbors. But as the music continued, something shifted between them. Vivian found herself relaxing into Paul's gentle lead, her body remembering steps she hadn't performed since before Samuel's birth. Paul drew her slightly closer, his hand warm and steady at her back, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Preston," Vivian murmured as he guided her through a turn. "I wouldn't have taken you for a dancing man." A smile touched Paul's lips. "My mother insisted all her sons learn, said a man who could dance properly would never lack for female company." "Wise woman," Vivian replied, surprising herself with the teasing tone. "She was indeed," Paul agreed. "She would have liked you, Vivian, your strength, your dignity. She valued those qualities highly." The simple compliment warmed Vivian more than elaborate flattery could have. As they continued to dance, the rest of the gathering seemed to fade into the background, the music, the lantern light, and Paul's steady presence creating a moment outside of time, untouched by the sorrows that had defined her recent past. When the song ended, Paul didn't immediately release her. Instead, he looked down at her with an expression that made her breath catch tenderness mingled with something deeper, more profound. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the dance?" Vivian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul shook his head slightly. "For being here. For helping make this place feel like home." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Vivian was saved from having to respond by the approach of Mrs. Holloway, who had come to announce her intention to return to town and to offer Vivian a ride back to the boarding house. "Unless you're planning to stay longer, dear?" the widow asked, her eyes twinkling with undisguised matchmaking enthusiasm. "I should get back," Vivian replied, conscious of propriety despite the evening's magic. "I have early shift at the store tomorrow. Paul nodded, understanding in his gaze. "I'll walk you to Mrs. Holloway's wagon." As they moved away from the celebration, Paul's hand came to rest lightly at the small of Vivian's back, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The touch sent a small shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. At the wagon, Paul helped Vivian up to the seat beside Mrs. Holloway, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. When she was settled, he looked up at her with an expression that made her heart race. "Would you come out here again tomorrow?" he asked. "There's something I'd like to show you." Something that couldn't wait for the gathering. Curiosity piqued, Vivian nodded. "What time?" "I'll come for you after church," Paul replied. "If that suits." "It does," Vivian agreed, wondering at the hint of nervousness she detected in his usually confident manner as Mrs. Holloway's wagon pulled away. Vivian found herself looking back at the figure of Paul Preston, standing tall in the lantern light, watching until they disappeared from view. Something was shifting between them, moving beyond friendship toward possibilities she had thought forever closed to her. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. The following day dawned clear and slightly cooler, a welcome respite from the August heat. Vivian attended church services with a distracted mind, barely registering the sermon as she wondered what Paul wanted to show her at the ranch. She had seen every aspect of the property during her previous visits. What could be so important that it required a special journey? True to his word, Paul was waiting outside the church when the service ended. He had traded his usual working clothes for a clean shirt and his best trousers, and had clearly made an effort to tame his usually unruly hair. The sight of him handsome in a rugged, unpretentious way caused a flutter in Vivian's chest that she no longer tried to deny. They rode to the ranch in Paul's wagon, the conversation flowing easily between them. Paul spoke of his plans for the coming weeks, finishing the cabin's interior, preparing for winter, acquiring a small herd of cattle in the spring. Vivian found herself offering suggestions and asking questions that assumed her continued interest in the ranch's development. A future connection she wasn't yet ready to name, but could no longer ignore. When they arrived at the property, Paul helped Vivian down from the wagon, then asked her to close her eyes. "It's a surprise," he explained, his voice betraying an unusual nervousness. "I want to get your honest reaction." Bemused but willing, Vivian complied. She felt Paul's hand take hers, his touch warm and reassuring as he guided her forward. They walked for perhaps a minute, changing direction several times before he brought her to a stop. "All right," he said softly. "You can look now." Vivian opened her eyes and gasped. They were standing in a small clearing near the cabin where Paul had created a garden. Not a vegetable plot for practical sustenance, but a flower garden with neatly defined beds, a small bench similar to the one they had built at Mrs. Holloway's, and plants that were clearly transplanted from the wilderness around them. Wild roses, columbines, lupines, and others Vivian didn't recognize. In the center of the garden stood a young oak tree, no more than a sapling, carefully planted and staked against the wind. "Paul," she whispered, emotion tightening her throat. "What is this?" He stood beside her, watching her reaction carefully. "It's for Samuel," he said simply. "And for you, a place to remember when you're ready, if you're ever ready." Tears filled Vivian's eyes, not the desperate, agonizing tears she had shed in the months after Samuel's death, but something gentler, healing. Paul had created this garden not to erase her loss or to suggest that her grief should be forgotten, but to acknowledge it, to give it a place in whatever future might be possible. "The oak," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Like the one at the homestead," Paul nodded. "It'll grow strong here. Good soil, plenty of water. In time, it'll be a fine tree." In time. The words echoed in Vivian's mind. Paul Preston was a patient man, willing to plant saplings that wouldn't reach their full growth for decades. Willing to nurture possibilities that might take years to fully bloom. "I don't know what to say," Vivian admitted, turning to look at him directly. It's the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." Paul's expression was solemn, his blue eyes intent on hers. "It's not just a gift, Vivian. It's a promise. That Samuel will always have a place here, that your past matters to me because it's part of you." The simple declaration broke something open in Vivian's heart, a door she had kept firmly closed since the day she buried her son. Standing in this garden created for remembrance, facing a man who offered not forgetfulness but integration of her past into a possible future, she felt the last of her defenses crumble. "Paul," she whispered, his name a question and an answer all at once. He stepped closer, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. "I love you, Vivian," he said simply. "I think I have since that first day in Silver Creek, when you stood your ground despite everything you'd lost. I'm not asking you to forget Samuel or to pretend that what happened with James didn't leave scars. I'm just asking for a chance to show you that love doesn't always end in loss." Vivian looked up at him, this steady, honorable man who had pursued justice for her son, who had given her time to heal, who had built a garden for remembrance. The words she had thought never to speak again rose to her lips, no longer frightening but freeing. "I love you too," she said softly. "I think I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself. Afraid that loving again meant betraying Samuel's memory or opening myself to more pain. But standing here, in this place you've created, I'm not afraid anymore." The smile that transformed Paul's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual but ultimately radiant. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he lowered his head until his lips met hers in a gentle kiss. Vivian's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. The kiss was brief, but profound, a promise exchanged without words, a beginning rather than an ending. When they parted, Paul kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "Believe in me, Vivian," he whispered. "That's all I ask. Not in God or fate or justice, just in me, in us. The rest will come in time." "I do believe in you," Vivian replied, the words feeling like a vow. "I believe in the man who keeps his promises, who builds gardens for remembrance, who sees my strength instead of my brokenness." They stood together in the garden as the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the young oak, casting dappled shadows across their entwined figures. In that moment, Vivian understood that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending that loss hadn't occurred. It was about finding the courage to weave that loss into a new pattern, to allow joy to exist alongside sorrow, to recognize that loving again didn't diminish what had been lost, but honored it. Samuel would always be her son. James's betrayal would always be part of her story. But they were no longer the only chapters in her life. Standing in Paul Preston's arms, in the garden he had created to honor her past while offering a future, Vivian McKenna chose to believe not in abstract concepts of God or fate, but in the tangible reality of this man and the love they had found against all odds. It was enough. It was everything. Epilogue: 2 years later, the Montana spring had come early, bringing an explosion of wildflowers to the rolling grasslands surrounding the Preston ranch. Vivian stood on the wide porch of the cabin, now expanded into a proper ranch house, watching as Paul led their daughter around the corral on the gentlest mare in their growing herd. Elizabeth McKenna Preston, 13 months old and fearless, squealed with delight as her father lifted her higher on the saddle, her tiny hands gripping the pommel with determination that belied her tender age. Dark curls so like Samuel's had been escaped from beneath her small bonnet, and her blue eyes, the image of her father's, sparkled with joy. "Not too fast," Vivian called, more out of maternal instinct than actual concern. She knew there was no safer place for Elizabeth than in Paul's capable hands. Paul grinned up at his wife, his expression a mixture of pride and mischief. "She's a natural, Vivian, going to be riding before she walks properly at this rate." Vivian shook her head, smiling despite herself. "She's not even walking steadily yet. Let's master one skill before taking on another." but her protest lacked conviction. In truth, Vivian loved watching the bond between father and daughter, the gentle way Paul handled Elizabeth, the absolute trust the child placed in him, the unguarded joy they took in each other's company. The ranch had prospered under Paul's careful management. What had begun as a simple cabin and a dream had grown into a respectable operation, not the largest in the territory by any means, but solid, profitable, and built to last. The herd numbered over 100 head now, with plans for expansion. The original cabin had been incorporated into a larger structure, with proper bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and the wide porch where Vivian now stood. Silver Creek itself had grown as well, with a new schoolhouse, a proper doctor's office, and talk of the railroad eventually coming through. Mr. Abernathy had taken on a partner at the general store, allowing Vivian to reduce her hours to occasional help during busy periods, and Mrs. Holloway had finally married the widower who had been courting her for years. Life had moved forward, as it always did on the frontier. But the past wasn't forgotten. Samuel's garden, as they had come to call it, had flourished under Vivian's care. The young oak had put on height and girth, its roots reaching deep into Montana soil. On the anniversary of his death each year, Vivian and Paul visited the garden together, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories of the boy who had never had the chance to know his stepfather. And once a year, they made the journey to the original homestead, to the grave beneath the older oak. They had placed a proper headstone there now, and Vivian always brought flowers from Samuel's garden to place upon it. It was a pilgrimage of remembrance, not of grief, a way of honoring what had been while celebrating what now was. Elizabeth's laughter brought Vivian back to the present. Paul had finished the ride and was lifting the child from the saddle, swinging her high in the air before settling her on his shoulders for the walk back to the house. "Mama," Elizabeth called, waving enthusiastically from her perch. "Horse?" "Yes, sweetheart," Vivian called back. "You rode the horse beautifully." As they approached the porch, Vivian moved to meet them, reaching up to take her daughter from Paul's shoulders. Elizabeth came willingly into her mother's arms, immediately beginning a stream of babble that contained a few recognizable words, horse and fast, featuring prominently. Paul leaned in to kiss Vivian's cheek, his hand coming to rest naturally at the small of her back. "She's fearless, just like her mother," he murmured. Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Fearless? Me? I think you have me confused with someone else, Mr. Preston." Paul's expression turned serious, his blue eyes holding hers with the same steady gaze that had first drawn her to him. "Not at all, Mrs. Preston. It takes extraordinary courage to love again after the kind of loss you suffered. To open your heart, to build a new life, to bring another child into a world that had already taken one from you. Don't tell me that's not fearlessness." The words touched Vivian deeply, as Paul's simple truths always did. She had never thought of herself as brave merely as a survivor, doing what was necessary to continue. But looking at her husband and daughter, at the home and life they had built together, she recognized the truth in his assessment. It had taken courage to marry Paul in Silver Creek's small church, with the entire town in attendance. It had taken courage to move to the ranch, to make it truly her home. And it had taken the greatest courage of all to discover she was carrying Elizabeth to embrace the joy of new life while honoring the child she had lost. "Perhaps you're right," she acknowledged softly. "Though I couldn't have found that courage without you believing in me first." Paul smiled, the expression warming his weathered features. "That was the easiest thing I've ever done, Vivian, believing in you." Elizabeth, growing restless in her mother's arms, began to squirm. "Down, Mama, down." Vivian set the child carefully on the porch, watching as she toddled determinedly toward the door, clearly intent on some new adventure inside the house. "I'll keep an eye on her," Paul offered. "You take some time for yourself. You've been busy all morning." Gratitude washed through Vivian at the simple thoughtfulness. This was Paul's way noticing what she needed, often before she recognized it herself. "I think I'll visit the garden," she decided. "The roses need pruning. Paul nodded, understanding in his gaze. "We'll be here when you return." It was a simple statement, but one that held profound meaning for Vivian. "We'll be here." A promise of continuity, of presence, of belonging. A promise that Paul Preston had never once broken in the years since he had ridden into Silver Creek and changed her life. Vivian made her way to Samuel's garden, now a riot of color as spring flowers reached their peak. The oak stood tall at its center, its branches spreading wider each year, offering dappled shade to the bench beneath. She sat for a moment, feeling the warm Montana sun on her face and listening to the distant sounds of ranch life, the lowing of cattle, the nickering of horses, the occasional shout of one of the hands. Grief no longer overwhelmed her when she came to this place. Instead, she felt a gentle melancholy mingled with genuine gratitude for the son she had been blessed to know, however briefly, and for the life that had emerged from the ashes of loss. She had stopped believing once in God, in goodness, in the possibility of happiness. A part of her had died alongside Samuel, beneath that distant oak. But Paul Preston had offered her something concrete to believe in when abstract faith had failed her: his steady presence, his unwavering integrity, his patient love that asked for nothing but the chance to prove itself. "Believe in me instead," he had said. And she had. That belief had led her here to a garden of remembrance and a house filled with new life, to a marriage built on truth rather than deception, to the sound of her daughter's laughter echoing across the Montana landscape. It hadn't erased the past or filled the Samuel-shaped hole in her heart. Nothing could do that, and Paul had never tried. Instead, he had helped her build a life large enough to contain both grief and joy, remembrance and hope, what had been lost and what had been found. As Vivian rose to begin the pruning she had come to do, she glanced back toward the house. Through the open door, she could see Paul kneeling on the floor, helping Elizabeth stack wooden blocks that inevitably tumbled down, causing peals of delighted laughter from both father and daughter. The sight filled her with a happiness so profound. It brought tears to her eyes, not the bitter tears of grief she had known so well, but the sweeter ones of gratitude for unexpected blessings. She had lost her child and stopped believing, but a steady-eyed cowboy had offered himself instead, and in believing in him, she had found her way back to life. Not the life she had planned or expected, but one rich with meaning and connection nonetheless. A life built not on blind faith but on daily choices to love, to remember, and to move forward one step, one day, one season at a time, and it was enough. It was everything.